a rare scene showing characters you hardly ever see in the movies, a mother, a father, and their child, a contemporary American family. Breaking Away is part of a quiet new trend at the box office, a small but encouraging movement toward more movies about family life. And that's our subject, films about families, on this special edition of Sneak Previews. Across the aisle from me is Gene Siskel, film critic of the Chicago Tribune.
And this is Roger Ebert, film critic at the Chicago Sun-Times. There is a trend toward more films about families, and the best news of all is that these films are turning out to be some of the best movies being made in Hollywood. Films like Robert Redford's Ordinary People, an early favorite for many of next year's Academy Awards. Also, The Great Santini with Robert Duvall as a very strong father. Going back a couple of years, I can think of Woody Allen's serious film Interiors, which, like Ordinary People, is about an uptight Waspis family where emotions are kept tightly in check. These are all fine films, and in each case, the subject is not an individual person. The subject is the family, which is quite a change, as we'll see later on in this show, from the films of the early 70s, when most American movies were about individuals acting by themselves, usually men alone without a family. But first, Roger begins by talking about the Academy Award-winning Kramer versus Kramer, the picture that, I guess, really kicked off this new boom in Hollywood family films.
Kramer versus Kramer was a film that hardly anybody originally wanted to produce. The movie's star, Dustin Hoffman, had to use his personal clout to get it made, and maybe he was as surprised as anyone when it turned into a popular hit. It proved that families were not poison at the box office. Kramer versus Kramer is basically about a man learning how to be a father. The man is played by Dustin Hoffman. He's a high-powered ad executive. He's too busy to even know what grade his child is in at school, but then suddenly his wife walks out on him, and he's left to learn by first-hand experience the difficult skills of child raising. Kramer versus Kramer isn't the only new film to give us a man in his 30s trying to penetrate the intricacies of the 6-year-old mind. Maybe because a lot of filmmakers and stars are in their 30s and are raising families, they find themselves drawing on their own experiences for movie ideas. For example, Paul Simon, the songwriter, he has a new movie out called One Trick Pony, which he plays an out-of-date folk singer who's a part-time father. Kind of neat the way he turns that playing ball with his kid into a production number.
Right.
Both of these scenes, with Dustin Hoffman and with Paul Simon, are warm, sensitive, private moments in the lives of adult males. And that's what makes them so revolutionary. They capture the wonderful tone of ordinary, everyday life.
Now, you know, these are not the first films that Hollywood has ever made about families. Years ago, of course, we had the Andy Hardy series, and then in television, we had Father Knows Best, that sort of thing. But whenever there were problems in those families, it was always at a very light level, and we really knew all the time that the families were going to work it out, it was going to be in control, and it was sort of like a ritual of problem solving. These new films, what makes them so attractive is we're not sure the family problems will be solved, and certainly the characters are not sure. They're scared to death, really, of this new responsibility, raising a family. So that's very exciting, and that's what's fresh about these Hollywood family films.
You know, another thing I like about these films is how differently the men are portrayed. In the late 60s and early 70s, in those films you were talking about, those guys, their hallmark was consistency. Characters like James Bond, like Dirty Harry, part of the joke, part of the entertainment of the film was the fact that they were so rigid, they acted exactly the same no matter what happened around them. And that predictability was part of, I guess, what entertained us. Now you see these guys in films, like Dustin Hoffman, like Paul Simon, some of the others we're going to look at, changing during the course of the film, learning how to be parents. They're different at the end of these films, and seeing them change is part of the fun of going to see these films.
It is a big difference. In the decade before Kramer versus Kramer, the majority of American movies were not about families. They were, for the most part, about men going off on their own, seeking their fortunes, trying to make it by hook or by crook in a hostile world. Pictures like with Jack Nicholson, I think. This was the era of the so-called buddy film, films with a couple of men banding together to fight for their independence and sometimes simply for their lives, in such movies as Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, the story of two loners turned bank robbers. Now, where were their families? Never mentioned. Also, Easy Rider, just men again. No mention of their families. Men selling drugs to finance a cross-country trip. And Midnight Cowboy, two men running away from their families to hustle on the streets of New York. Two men finding human contact with each other, not with their families. Now, those were some of the most honored and financially successful films of the late 60s and early 70s, men doing their thing.
Well, in that case, when did the movies begin to rediscover the realities of family life? It's sort of hard to pick an exact moment. There were all those comedies about families back in the 1960s. They were mostly about enormous broods of untamed kids. Remember 8 on the Lamb? With 6 you get egg roll, yours, mine, and ours. But now we're getting these new, thoughtful films, the ones that take a long, hard, and honest look at the difficulties of people raising families, living together, trying to work things out. These films were really inspired, I think, by two ambitious television series in 1973 and by a maverick American film in 1974. The first TV series was Scenes from a Marriage, a six-part serial by the great Swedish director Ingmar Bergman. It was first a hit on Swedish television, then it played in a shortened version in American movie theaters, and then it was serialized in its uncut version on public broadcasting. Scenes from a Marriage had enormous influence. It was almost as if Bergman had discovered a new, untapped subject matter right under our noses. So, three pioneering projects, Scenes from a Marriage, An American Family, and A Woman Under the Influence. They were all grouped together in 1973 and 1974, and they opened up an undiscovered country for the new generation of American filmmakers. They started a lot of people thinking.
I think what we get here is really an understanding now of how trends work in the movies. First, the independents, the experimental people, the people working in foreign films. These are the people that start a trend, then commercial Hollywood picks it up and imitates it.
One of the reasons for that, I think, is that there's so much lead time in the case of a major film. It can take 18 months to 2 years to get it on the screen. These guys come in, they have small budgets, they work fast, they work directly from their own instincts and ideas, and they're able to get right on top of things as they feel them.
Now, one change with these family films is that normally when the big Hollywood producers and stars get involved in imitating something that they've seen in a good foreign film or independent TV documentary, they muck it up. They screw it up. They enlarge it, romanticize it. In this case, again, what's special about these Hollywood films about families is not that they're just about families, but that they're so darn good.
You know, that might be because the people making the big Hollywood pictures find this subject just as important and just as personal as the independent guys like Cassavetes. People like Robert Redford and Dustin Hoffman are also working out of their own experience. That's kind of unique in any film.
As parents on their own. Right? Well, so far we've talked about two new films, Kramer versus Kramer and One Trick Pony, that showed men learning how to be fathers, men uncertain, really, of the role a father should play. In contrast is The Great Santini, a movie that has gained part of its appeal from offering a strong father, a very strong, old-fashioned father, with Robert Duvall as Marine Colonel Bull Meacham running roughshod over his children, as in this scene where he gathers his kids before him for a morning briefing, sort of like a football coach calling his children hogs. Yes, he's tough, but engagingly so, and that's the source of our interest in The Great Santini, a brutally tough father who does, at his base, care for his kids. Yes, he's a chauvinistic jerk at times, but as played by Robert Duvall, Bull Meacham is an undeniably appealing character because he is the guiding force in a family that works together as a unit. Unlike Kramer versus Kramer and One Trick Pony, which give us uncertain men struggling to cope with fatherhood, The Great Santini does give us a family that functions well because of a strong father, and let's not forget, an understanding mother.
I think I see a slightly different film than you do in The Great Santini, but I like it just as much. I think that here what the family does is compensate for the weaknesses of various members, and especially that father. Sure, he's strong, but he's also weak, and the mother understands him. She loves him. She explains him to the kids, so the kids understand him too, and you see the family as a unit working to make everybody a little happier than they certainly would be on their own.
It's a strong, appealing family, regardless of who's responsible for it working. The fact that it does work, we haven't seen that very much before. We see the family breaking down in Kramer versus Kramer and troubled parents in One Trick Pony. Here is a family that works. The most important thing to each of the members is they are Meachams, something that this guy Duvall, Bull Meacham, really hammers home.
Oh, it's a good film. Two more very good recent movies are portraits, though, of emotionally unhealthy families, where feelings are tightly restrained and where family members can't talk honestly with one another, and that causes them a lot of unhappiness. One of those films is by a comedy director, Woody Allen, who got serious in a very good 1978 drama named Interiors. And in this key scene, after years of marriage, the husband, E.G. Marshall, tells his wife, played by Geraldine Page, and their daughters that he's had enough. Superb acting and reacting there. Now, here's another example. This year's surprisingly popular new film, Ordinary People, is about another unhappy family, but one where some growth does take place and where some communication does become possible. Now, here's a scene filled with underlying tension. To begin with, it almost looks like a TV commercial. You have the grandparents, the mother and dad, the teenage kids are taking snapshots of one another, but there's so much tension in this room that you can almost feel it. That's really a strong scene. You can see that tension building and building, and the longer they hold it, the more of an explosion it is when it finally comes. Both in Interiors and in Ordinary People, I think we have basically the same message. If you bottle up emotions long enough, you're going to create all kinds of underlying unhappiness anxiety, and fear. And so for better or worse, sometimes it's just absolutely necessary to let your feelings out and to tell people what you really think.
Well, we've talked about a lot of good movies, a lot of family films. I think maybe the question now, of course, is why are we getting them? We've seen it with the independents now, commercial Hollywood filmmakers. I think one of the most interesting ideas on why it's happening is simply a matter of fact of age. The filmmakers, we're talking about Robert Redford directing Ordinary People, Hoffman in Kramer versus Kramer, Paul Simon's story. These are all guys in their low 40s. They've all been married. I think they all have children. What they're writing about is their lives now. These are no longer independent gunslingers going off across the country. They have done that. They made their careers. Now it's family life that they're experiencing, and that's what they're making their films about.
You know, there's another thing here, too. We've talked on this show before about this notion of coalesced dreams, the sense that when a lot of movies come out at the same time that are about the same thing, in some way, maybe they reflect things that we're all thinking and we're all believing, we're all experiencing. In the case of families, those films in the late 60s and early 70s came at a time of great narcissism in American society. They called it the me generation. People were talking about themselves, doing their own thing. That's no longer the case. These people now have grown up. The baby boom is in its 30s. People are getting married. They're starting families. They're finding it's very important to learn how to relate and that you can be happier yourself if you're happier in your relationships with other people. So these films, in a sense, may show that discovery on the part of some of their makers.
And again, they're good films, and I think it may express the kind of interest and real concern that everybody is having now, people of this age group, with how to raise a family, how to relate to a husband or a wife. Very exciting development. Let's conclude our show on the emergence of the family film with a scene from one of the most appealing family films ever made. That's Breaking Away, the story of a working-class family in Indiana. It's a family full of love, respect, and understanding for one another. Late in the movie, in one of the most touching father-son conversations ever put on film, the son listens to his father talk about the Indiana University campus and how he worked there as a cutter, cutting the limestone to help build it. That's an eloquent statement by a father of how he wants his son to achieve more than he has with his own life. When you look at a scene like that, it's easy to see why we're getting a bunch of films now about families. What could be a better subject for a film than people? The people who affect us most are families. Inherent drama in that.
You know, Gene, I'm very encouraged by these films because each one of these films was made by a person or people who really cared about what they were saying about these characters, how they related to each other, what it means to be alive and try to cooperate with other human beings. And so often, when I, as a professional movie critic, when I go to the movies, 300 or 400 movies a year, I come out dispirited because the films are exploitation films that have a very low opinion of their audiences and a very base view of human nature. And it's really great to see films like these. I'd like to see any of these films again, especially scenes from a marriage, because I can learn from them, and they help me to grow.
Well, I agree with you, and I'm looking forward to the Academy Awards next year because Kramer versus Kramer won this past year. I think that if Ordinary People, which is probably the front runner for the Academy Award as Best Picture, if Ordinary People or Great Santini should win an Academy Award, I think that's going to keep the trend going and encourage more and more filmmakers to make these personal stories about families. It's an exciting trend.
I really hope so. That's it for this week's show, the special program on the new and encouraging trend toward films about families. Next time on Sneak Previews, we'll review 5 more new films, and until then, we'll see you at the movies.